The wind howled softly across the desolate plains as the crumbling silhouette of Eldrin Castle emerged beneath a silver moon. Perched atop a jagged hill, its towers seemed to pierce the night sky, standing as a solemn reminder of an age when knights and kings shaped the land. This was no ordinary castle. It was a place where legends lingered, and the weight of the past was felt in every stone. Tonight, within its ancient halls, a single figure stood guard. Sir Eryndor, the knight chosen for this sacred duty, moved silently through the great hall. His armor, though scuffed and weathered by years of battle, caught faint glimmers of light from the crackling hearth. The room smelled of burning wood, damp stone, and the faint metallic tang of old swords mounted upon the walls. Shadows danced across vaulted ceilings as the fire flickered, casting fleeting shapes that teased at the edge of imagination. Every creak of the floor and whisper of the wind heightened the solitude of his vigil. Eryndor had been tasked with a duty that no one else dared accept, to protect the sacred relic of Eldrin Castle, an artifact said to hold the hope of the kingdom within its crystalline heart. The gem rested in the center of the hall, encased in a silver stand etched with runes that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. Legends told of its power to ward off darkness and despair, but such tales came with warnings of the spirits that haunted the castle's walls. The knight's brow furrowed as he approached the relic, his footsteps muffled by the heavy tapestries that lined the cold stone floor. He bowed his head briefly, murmuring a quiet prayer as his calloused hand rested on the hilt of his sword. He had heard the stories of knights who had stood in this very hall only to falter, consumed by the ghosts of their fears. But Sir Eryndor was no stranger to hardship. He had fought on distant battlefields, endured bitter winters, and faced enemies who towered over him. And yet there was something about the castle's silence that felt heavier than any sword he had lifted. The wind outside picked up, rattling the tall iron gates in the distance. Somewhere in the shadows of the castle, a door creaked open, though no footsteps followed. The sound of an owl's mournful hoot echoed faintly through the rafters, and for a moment the knight's hand tightened on his sword's pommel. He drew a slow, measured breath, reminding himself of the discipline that had carried him through countless battles. He was not here to fight flesh and blood. His enemy tonight was fear itself. Above him, the stained glass windows depicted scenes of heroic deeds and solemn sacrifice. The faces of long-forgotten knights seemed to gaze down at him, their eyes filled with unspoken expectations. The weight of their legacy pressed against him, but he stood firm, his resolve unbroken. He would not let the relic fall, nor would he falter in the face of the unknown. As the hours stretched on, the castle seemed to breathe around him. The faint whispers of the wind slid through the cracks in the stone, mingling with the occasional snap of the fire. Sir Eryndor's heartbeat slowed as he settled into his post, his shadow stretching across the relic like a guardian spirit. He would remain here until the first light of dawn, a solitary figure standing against the unseen. And though the darkness seemed endless, a glimmer of hope lingered in the sacred gem's gentle glow. Chapter 1. The Relic and Its Significance. As the embers of the castle's hearth cast a dim, flickering light, Sir Eryndor's gaze settled once more on the relic, a gem so brilliant it seemed almost alive, even in the shadowed gloom of the great hall. Resting within its silver stand, the artifact radiated an otherworldly glow that ebbed and pulsed, as though it held the heartbeat of a forgotten age. To the untrained eye, it might appear as no more than a finely cut crystal. But to those who knew the legends, it was a symbol of hope, power, and peril. The relic, known as the Star of Eldrin, was said to have been forged in an age when magic and men walked the earth in uneasy harmony. Enchanted by an ancient order of mystics, the gem was imbued with the power to shield the kingdom from the forces of darkness. For centuries, its presence had ensured peace, its light warding off the shadows of despair and the specters of chaos. Yet the relic came with a warning. It required constant vigilance, for its allure attracted not only the noble-hearted, but also those consumed by greed and malice. Eryndor had been told these tales countless times during his training, but standing before the relic now, the weight of the stories seemed more real than ever. The castle had once been the heart of the kingdom's defenses, its halls bustling with knights, scholars, and artisans. Yet over time, the tides of war and the march of years had left it hollowed out, its grandeur faded to ruins. Now, only echoes and whispers remained, and the sacred duty of protecting the relic had fallen to him, a solitary knight with nothing but his honor and courage to shield him. The relic's history was etched not only in legend, but also in scars. Along its once perfect surface were faint cracks, said to have formed during a great battle centuries earlier when the castle was besieged. The invading army, desperate to claim the relic, had unleashed a powerful curse upon the stronghold. Though the knights of Eldrin had triumphed, the cost had been immense. Many had fallen, and those who survived spoke of haunting visions and ghostly apparitions that still lingered in the castle's shadowed corridors. Eryndor's mentor, an aged knight who had stood vigil before him, had shared these tales as warnings. "The relic tests all who guard it," he had said, his voice heavy with the wisdom of experience. "It does not merely attract enemies from without, but awakens the fears and regrets hidden within. A knight's mettle is not tested by his blade, but by the strength of his spirit." These words echoed in Eryndor's mind as he circled the relic, his armored boots brushing against the cold stone floor. Outside, the wind howled with renewed vigor, battering the castle's walls like the distant roar of a phantom army. Every sound, the groan of wood, the rustle of tapestries, seemed magnified, as though the castle itself were alive, watching his every move. Despite the eerie stillness, Eryndor's resolve did not waver. He had sworn an oath to protect the Star of Eldrin, and he would not falter. The knight paused, allowing his fingers to rest lightly on the relic's silver stand. A faint warmth radiated through the metal, as though the gem recognized his presence. It was a comfort, a reminder that the relic's power was not merely a legend, but a living force, anchoring him against the unseen. As the hours stretched on, Eryndor reflected on the lives of those who had stood in this hall before him. He imagined their struggles, their triumphs, and the sacrifices they had made to ensure the relic's protection. In their shadows, he found strength, not only to honor their legacy, but to face whatever the night would bring. The castle groaned once more, and a faint whisper seemed to drift through the hall, carrying words just beyond the edge of comprehension. Eryndor tightened his grip on his sword, his heart steady despite the chill that crept along his spine. The test of the night had only just begun, and the relic's light, faint yet unwavering, became his guide in the gathering darkness. Chapter 2. The First Night. The heavy silence of the castle deepened as the hours dragged on. Sir Eryndor, steadfast and vigilant, stood guard in the great hall where shadows danced along the walls like ghostly sentinels. The crackle of the hearth fire offered little comfort against the vast emptiness that surrounded him. Outside, the wind whistled through the stone battlements, its mournful howl a constant reminder of the desolation beyond. Eryndor paced the hall, his boots echoing against the worn flagstones. His sword remained at his side, the weight of it a reassuring presence. He scanned the dark corners of the room where the flickering firelight could not reach, his eyes keen and alert. Yet it was not an intruder of flesh and blood he expected. It was the whispers of the past, the restless spirits said to roam these halls, bound to the castle by duty, regret, or something more sinister. The first sign came as a faint rustle, as if a tapestry had shifted in a non-existent breeze. Eryndor froze, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. His eyes darted toward the source of the sound, but the hall remained still. Slowly he exhaled, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. He knew better than to let his imagination take hold. The castle, ancient and vast, was full of creaks and groans, its stones settling under the weight of centuries. Still, the noise lingered in his mind, a seed of unease that refused to be shaken. The second sign was harder to dismiss. A faint thud echoed from above, like the sound of heavy boots crossing a distant floor. Eryndor's heart quickened, but his expression remained calm. He tilted his head, listening intently, but the sound did not come again. He considered the possibility of an animal, a bird or perhaps a rat, but he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. The castle's legends began to stir in his thoughts. He had heard of knights who had faltered during their vigils, driven to madness by the apparitions that haunted the relic's sacred chamber. They spoke of ghostly figures that whispered the fears of the living, shadows that moved with a life of their own, and the relentless weight of isolation. Eryndor pushed these stories aside, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of his own breathing and the reassuring warmth of the relic's glow. He resumed his pacing, the soft clink of his armor filling the silence. The fire in the hearth burned lower, casting the room in dim, shifting light. As the night wore on, the castle seemed to come alive around him. The creak of a distant door, the faint hum of the wind winding through the cracks in the stone, the occasional thud of falling dust. Each sound seemed to carry an eerie cadence, as though the castle itself were testing his resolve. Then, faintly, he heard it, a whisper. It was not the howl of the wind or the groan of the ancient timbers, but something unmistakably human. The voice was soft and low, speaking words he could not understand. Eryndor turned sharply, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword as he scanned the room. There was no one there. Yet the whisper came again, drifting through the air like a memory brought to life. "Who's there?" Eryndor called, his voice steady but firm. The whisper faded into silence, leaving only the sound of his heartbeat thrumming in his ears. He moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, his eyes sweeping the room for any sign of movement. The relic's faint glow reflected off his armor, a reminder of the sacred duty that bound him to this place. As he reached the far end of the hall, a chill swept over him, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. It was not the natural cold of the castle's drafty corridors, but something deeper, something that seemed to reach into his very bones. He paused, his breath shallow, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow shift against the far wall. But when he blinked, it was gone. Eryndor returned to the relic, his resolve unbroken but his mind alert. He could feel the weight of the night pressing against him, the castle's ancient ghosts testing his courage. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself with a silent prayer. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. The kingdom's hope depended on his strength, and he would not falter. As the fire in the hearth flickered and the wind howled louder outside, Sir Eryndor stood tall. The relic's faint glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, a silent reassurance that he was not truly alone. The first night of his vigil was far from over, and the darkness still held many secrets, but the knight remained steadfast, his courage unwavering in the face of the unknown. Chapter 3. Ghosts of the Past. The deep stillness of the castle was suddenly broken by the faint toll of a bell, a sound that Eryndor knew could not be real. The castle's bell tower had long since crumbled, its iron bell buried beneath rubble and vines. Yet the mournful chime echoed through the halls, soft but distinct, as if calling out to someone long gone. Sir Eryndor froze, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. His breath misted faintly in the cold air as he scanned the room, his heart steady but his senses sharpened. The fire in the hearth sputtered, and the shadows on the walls grew restless, shifting and flickering like figures caught between two worlds. From the corner of his eye, Eryndor caught movement, a fleeting form, pale and shimmering, that seemed to linger just beyond the reach of the firelight. He turned quickly, but the figure was gone, leaving only an unsettling quiet in its wake. "Reveal yourself," Eryndor commanded, his voice firm yet respectful. He knew the stories of the spirits bound to the castle, knights who had failed in their duty, their regrets tethering them to the world of the living. Though they were said to be restless and mournful, they were not hostile. Still, Eryndor's grip on his sword remained tight as he waited. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until a soft whisper broke through. "Why do you stand here, alone in the darkness?" The voice was low and haunting, carrying an edge of sorrow that seemed to echo in the depths of the knight's own heart. Eryndor turned toward the sound, and there, emerging from the shadows, was the faint outline of a man clad in ghostly armor. His face was obscured, his features blurred as if viewed through mist, but his presence was undeniable. The spirit moved slowly, its steps silent as it approached the relic at the center of the hall. It raised a translucent hand, as though reaching for the gem, but stopped short, its form trembling with an emotion Eryndor could not place. "You are bound here," Eryndor said softly, lowering his sword but keeping his stance defensive. "What ties you to this place, spirit?" The ghost turned toward him, and though its face was indistinct, Eryndor felt the weight of its gaze. "I, too, once stood where you stand," the spirit said, its voice laced with regret. "I vowed to protect the relic, to defend the kingdom, but I failed. I faltered when the darkness came, and now I am but a shadow, a reminder of what was lost." Eryndor's grip on his sword tightened. "The darkness tests us all," he said, "but the past cannot be undone. Only the present matters now." The ghost let out a soft, mournful laugh. "You speak with the certainty of the living. But tell me, knight, what will you do when your strength fades, when the weight of solitude and fear becomes too great? Will you endure, or will you falter as I did?" Eryndor took a step forward, his armor glinting faintly in the relic's light. "I will endure," he said firmly, "not because I am unafraid, but because this duty is greater than my fear." The spirit seemed to study him for a moment, its form flickering like the dying embers of a fire. "Perhaps you will succeed where I failed," it said quietly. "But beware, knight. The castle is alive with memories, and they will test the depths of your resolve. Face them with courage, and you may yet prevail." With that, the ghost began to fade, its shimmering outline dissolving into the shadows. The room grew still once more, the only sound the faint crackle of the hearth. Eryndor remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the spot where the spirit had vanished. Though the encounter had unsettled him, it had also steeled his resolve. The castle's ghosts were not enemies, but echoes of those who had come before, warnings from the past, meant to guide the present. As the night wore on, Eryndor resumed his vigil, his steps slow and deliberate. He felt the weight of the relic's glow against his back, a constant reminder of the sacred duty he bore. The castle seemed to watch him, its whispers growing softer but no less present. Every shadow, every sound, seemed imbued with meaning, as if the very stones of the fortress held their breath, waiting to see if this night would succeed where so many others had failed. Though the dawn was still hours away, Eryndor stood firm. The ghosts of the past had spoken, and their warnings echoed in his mind. But he was not alone. The legacy of those who had come before him, their triumphs and failures alike, stood with him in the hall. And, as long as the relic's light endured, so too would he. Chapter 4. The Test of Courage. As the darkest hours of the night enveloped the castle, an unsettling stillness fell over the great hall. The wind outside had quieted, leaving only the occasional creak of the ancient structure to break the silence. Sir Eryndor remained resolute, but an intangible weight pressed down on him, as though the air itself carried the whispers of the past and the promises of an uncertain future. It began subtly, a faint pulse of light emanating from the relic at the heart of the hall. The gem, once steady in its soft glow, now flickered as if responding to an unseen presence. Eryndor's eyes narrowed, and his grip on the hilt of his sword tightened. The relic was awakening, its power stirring in response to a looming threat. The first sound was a distant rumble, low and resonant, echoing from deep within the castle's foundation. It was followed by the groan of shifting stone, as though the fortress itself were coming alive. Eryndor turned toward the source of the noise, his posture rigid, his senses heightened. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching and writhing like living things. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a bitter chill seeped into the room. Frost began to creep along the edges of the relic's silver stand, its crystalline surface refracting the dim firelight into shards of cold brilliance. From the farthest corner of the hall, where the darkness was thickest, a figure began to emerge. It was no spirit like those he had encountered before. This was something more substantial, more menacing. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, its form shrouded in darkness that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. Its eyes, faintly glowing and cold as winter's breath, locked onto Eryndor with an unyielding intensity. The knight took a step forward, positioning himself between the relic and the intruder. His sword gleamed faintly in the flickering light, its edge steady despite the tremor in the air. The figure spoke, its voice a chilling blend of whispers and growls. "You stand in defiance of the inevitable, knight. Step aside, and I will spare you the torment of failure." Eryndor's jaw tightened, his resolve unwavering. "I stand in service of the relic and the kingdom it protects. You will not take it." The entity let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound reverberating through the hall like a distant thunderstorm. "Foolish mortal," it hissed, "your strength will falter, your courage will crumble, and the light you protect will fade into nothingness." Without another word, the figure lunged forward, its shadowy form surging like a storm cloud. Eryndor met the charge head-on, his sword slicing through the darkness with a sharp, resonant clang. The sound echoed through the hall, followed by a rush of icy wind that extinguished the remaining embers in the hearth. For a moment, the room was plunged into total darkness, save for the faint, flickering glow of the relic. The battle that followed was unlike any Eryndor had ever faced. The figure's movements were swift and fluid, its strikes unpredictable. Each clash of blade and shadow sent shockwaves through the air, rattling the ancient stone walls. Yet, as the fight wore on, Eryndor began to notice something. The figure's attacks were not as relentless as they seemed. It was probing him, testing his resolve, exploiting his fears. The knight's thoughts began to spiral. What if the ghost's warning had been true? What if his strength did fail? What if he too was destined to become another shadow bound to these halls? The doubts clawed at his mind, their whispers louder than the clash of steel. But then he felt it, a warmth radiating from behind him. The relic's glow, faint but steady, pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. It was a reminder of why he stood there, of the duty that transcended his fears. Drawing a deep breath, Eryndor steadied his thoughts. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, silencing the noise within, and when he opened them, his focus was unbreakable. With renewed determination, he pressed forward, his strikes gaining strength and precision. The figure faltered, its form flickering like a dying flame. It lashed out one final time, a desperate attempt to overwhelm the knight, but Eryndor stood firm. With a powerful swing, his blade cut through the shadow, shattering it into tendrils of darkness that dissolved into the air. Silence fell over the hall once more. The relic's glow brightened, banishing the lingering shadows and filling the room with a soothing light. Eryndor stood motionless for a moment, his breath heavy, his body trembling from the exertion. But he had prevailed. The darkness had tested him, and he had proven that his courage was stronger than his fears. As he sheathed his sword, the frost on the relic's stand began to melt, droplets of water glistening in the warm light. The castle seemed to sigh, its oppressive weight lifting, leaving behind a sense of calm. Eryndor turned toward the relic, bowing his head in silent gratitude. The kingdom's hope was safe, at least for one more night. With the dawn still hours away, the knight resumed his vigil. The hall was quiet now, save for the gentle hum of the relic's light and the faint rustle of the wind outside. Sir Eryndor knew that the challenges were far from over, but his spirit was unbroken. Whatever trials awaited, he would face them with the same unyielding resolve. For this was his duty, his purpose, and his redemption. Chapter 5. The Dawn of Redemption. As the first light of dawn broke over the jagged horizon, a soft golden glow seeped through the castle's high, narrow windows. The darkness that had held the halls captive for so long began to retreat, dissolving into the corners of the ancient fortress. The relic's steady light dimmed slightly, as if bowing to the arrival of the morning sun. Sir Eryndor, weary but resolute, stood tall in the center of the hall, his armor glinting faintly in the growing light. The knight exhaled deeply, his breath no longer clouding in the chilled air. the stillness of the castle now felt different. Not oppressive or eerie, but peaceful, as though the spirits and shadows that had lingered in its depths had finally found rest. Eryndor allowed himself a brief moment of relief, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. He had endured the night, faced the trials of the relic, and emerged with his honor intact. Eryndor approached the relic, its crystalline surface shimmering like a dew-kissed flower in the morning sun. The warmth it radiated was now gentle and comforting, a stark contrast to the icy tendrils of fear and doubt that had tested him mere hours ago. He knelt before it, bowing his head in a gesture of reverence and gratitude. "This night," he murmured softly, "has shown me the strength of those who came before and the courage I must carry forward. May the light of this relic continue to protect the kingdom, and may my resolve honor those who have fallen." The castle seemed to respond with a low, rumbling hum, as though acknowledging his words. Eryndor rose to his feet, his body aching but his spirit renewed. He turned to face the empty hall where the shadows had once loomed so heavily. Now they were merely shadows, cast by the gentle sunlight filtering through the windows. As he made his way to the castle's outer walls, the sounds of the waking world greeted him. Birds chirped in the distance, their melodies weaving through the crisp morning air. The wind, once howling with ghostly menace, now carried a soft breeze that rustled the ivy clinging to the castle walls. Eryndor paused at the battlements, looking out over the vast plains that stretched toward the horizon. The land, bathed in dawn's light, seemed to breathe with new life. Though the night had tested him, Eryndor felt no bitterness toward the trials he had endured. Instead, he saw them as a reminder of his purpose and the sacred duty entrusted to him. The relic and the hope it represented had been safeguarded for another day. And though the shadows would return with the night knew he would be ready to face them. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Eryndor allowed himself a rare moment of rest. Sitting on a stone bench near the castle gate, he closed his eyes and leaned back against the cool stone. The relic's light still lingered faintly in his mind, a symbol of resilience and hope. And as the warmth of the sun embraced him, Sir Eryndor drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the peace of the dawn washing over him. For the night, the vigil was not merely a test, but a journey, a bridge between the past and the future, between fear and courage. The sacred relic remained safe in its chamber, a beacon of light and a promise of protection. And while the castle's shadows would return with the setting sun, they would find Sir Eryndor ready to stand his ground once more, a steadfast guardian of hope.